My name is Stephanie Bothwell, and I am the moderator for this session. I hope you're in the right one, too much water or too little, using the landscape to advance regional sustainability without destroying urbanism, a Florida transect. Trying to do a Florida transect is kind of a challenge. And we're going to take it on at multiple scales. But before I get there, I just want to let you know that the situation, the water situation across the world, across our country, certainly in Florida, is quite an important issue, and very much, I think, will be more and more the topic of conversation, and will probably drive conversations about development, where to develop, where not to develop. And we also are going to take on this session a little bit about global warming, which adds a little bit to the already complex physical environment here and climatological environment. I actually did my undergraduate environmental studies work here in Florida and found myself at a rather young age walking waist deep through the Everglades, trying to figure out and understand the flora, the fauna, and the unique ecology of Florida. And that's sort of one of the reasons I agreed to take on this session. And of course, when we were out waist deep in the water, there was always a young man that would cry, "Alligator," and send us all scurrying. As I was preparing for this session and really thinking about what has transpired in the last 30, 40 years of development and the situation with water in Florida, I was sitting one day at my dining room table and picked up the Washington Post, and there on the front page was an article about the Burmese python that escaped, mated, is proliferating and eating everything furry and non-furry in its path, and becoming sort of the top of the food chain for the Everglades. And I thought maybe you would allow me some poetic license and allow it to be our metaphor for today. We're the python, we're eating all the water. How many are actually from Florida in the room? So you all have a lot to contribute to this conversation as we get further into the discussion. And many of you will know some of the projects that we're talking about may be involved. Is anyone involved either in Dade County or with the Treasure Coast efforts that have gone on so far? Anyone here with that? Okay. Our first presenter is Jonathan Barnett, and he is from the University of Pennsylvania, professor of city and regional planning, director of the urban design programs there, and the most recent book, which you can get in the bookstore, is City Design. And I've asked him to go first because I think he has probably the most global perspective on this issue. Jonathan?
Thank you, Stephanie. The issue, I think, is whether urbanization and the natural environment can coexist in the long run in Florida. Water is certainly a very important part of it, but I'm taking a slightly broader view of it and asking how do you manage growth as it's going to be, as predicted to be happening in Florida? How do you manage growth and preserve the natural environment at the same time? And how do you adjust to the changes in the natural environment which are likely to happen in the next 20 or 30 years? Start with Central Florida. I did a study with a group of students from the University of Pennsylvania, which is sponsored by myregion.org and the Tampa Region Business Development Group. And everybody has different terms for Central Florida. This is Central Florida as it was defined for this study. One of the things we assumed at the beginning of the study, this was before the governor decided that to tell the feds to keep their money, there was actually a funded high-speed rail project in Florida, the second time actually Florida had such a thing, and there's a leg of it which would be built between Orlando and Tampa. We assumed that, and the long-range plan for high-speed rail, which is actually on the Florida State Department of Transportation website. It's still an official plan in Florida. And we assumed transportation networks which would connect to it, some of which, like Sunrail, are actually perhaps still happening. Then we used GIS, which is, I'm learning, a wonderful tool, and we took the natural issues related to Central Florida, and we asked ourselves what were the priority pieces of property that need to be acquired or safeguarded in order to safeguard the environment. And what happens in Florida is you have actually a wonderful program in the state for acquiring property, but it isn't always the highest priority places. So what the studio was able to do was they took a whole bunch of different criteria, significant, you can read them, of which surface water and the recharging of the aquifer were important components, and also habitat, safeguarding of wetlands as a part of the environmental ecosystem, which is really important, and also soil quality, assigned weights to these various criteria, and then in GIS produced what we called the ideal conservation network. So 3 million acres of land came out as priority land, of which 40% was already protected. So that became one component. This became the framework for urbanization. In other words, if you know what land needs to be protected to safeguard the environment, how do you guide development? So then we did an exercise, which I think you've seen a number of times in Florida. We've done several of them, in which we said, this is your population projections, the official ones the state is using, and this is this trend, which we are also reproducing in GIS, for what's likely to happen by 2030. Of course, the moment we did this study, the number of people moving to Florida dropped noticeably, so that the usual problem with straight line projections is that maybe it's not such a straight line. However, I think in the long run, nobody in Florida said that this isn't going to happen. So here's the population trend and typical development as it's been being done now, 2050, and with the environmental impact of that, you would lose the acreages which is showing up on the screen, so that some 300,000 very important acres would be lost to development under this scenario as predicted by the GIS. So then we said, okay, if you followed another policy in which you went back and you said, okay, we are going to safeguard the land which is coming up in the environmental ideal conservation network as the land that needs to be preserved, what if you have this computer prediction and you run around out in front of it and you conserve the land that would otherwise be consumed in the, according to the GIS prediction, and then run the GIS again, showing what would happen if you do preserve that, and so forth. And this way, the other thing is we're assuming the transportation network that I showed you at the beginning, and assigned weights to that in GIS to say that these transportation locations have attracted a higher density of population. And we used a very low higher density. It was like something like 3 dwelling units to the acre, way below what you would necessarily expect for a transportation-oriented development. And you still have a huge saving in conservation if you follow that scenario. So by 2050, you can conserve the 1.3 million acres of land which would be most threatened by development. And it's a little hard. The alternative is now switched to the left-hand side, so that you see how much less land area is consumed if you adopt a transportation-rich environment and you safeguard. It's a two-pronged strategy that you attract development to transit-rich locations and you forestall development in places which are sensitive and prone to develop by getting out in front of the development trend and acquiring that kind of property. And here's your statistic. What we discovered is you save a huge amount of money in infrastructure by not having to develop that acreage. And that's more than enough money to go out and acquire the property. The trouble with that is that it's like a trope that my wife and I have, that we finance things by things that we haven't bought. But the problem, as you see, is that the system is all set up to, so we don't own a Rolls-Royce, so we can afford to take a 2-month vacation and so forth. The problem is that the money saved in infrastructure costs is future money, that the infrastructure costs all come through the existing development system and are paid for by the usual taxes and exactions. So in order to save this money, you have to find another source of money up front. We then also did a comparable study for the whole state of Florida. We actually did this earlier, in which we did the same thing. We looked at an ideal conservation network for the state of Florida. We also, in this one, looked at sea level rise and its probable effect on coastal zones. We only showed that as land that would be underwater. In 2007, we were actually a little bit too conservative, I think. We used the consensus world sea level rise view at that time, and people are now saying it's likely to be much worse than that. But we didn't, the same thing, we assumed Florida's high-speed rail connection. This was before the fleeting moment when it looked like you were going to build it, but you already had a state plan for doing it. And then we also looked at coastal hazard, and we sort of played this down in our presentations in Florida. This was sponsored by the 1,000 Friends of Florida, and we weren't sure whether people were really ready to hear it. But the problem with sea level rise is not just that you can predict that the high tides are going to be higher, but also that if there's a storm surge and because of a hurricane, that the effect of the storm surge would be much more severe. So you can see in these diagrams that Florida Keys, for example, are a real problem area, even under very conservative predictions about sea level rise. It's not like you can't preserve them, but you have a situation like the Netherlands where you have to do a lot of work to make sure that they're there. We also zeroed in on some specific locations. So here's Central Florida as defined in that study. Here's the trend. Here's the alternative. We're using the ideal conservation network and the same methodology I mentioned previously. And for some reason, the students, when they did these maps, put the sea level rise into the alternative but not into the trend. However, the trend is equally likely to have the sea level rise. In fact, possibly more likely. So you need to sort of imagine that the sea level rise is occurring in both places. And so here's Central Florida. Here's South Florida, where you have the most severe sea level rise situation. There's really a major change in the Everglades if you have anything like the predicted level of sea level rise. So that becomes a kind of third issue, that you have the trend in Florida, which is towards increased urbanization, and the increased urbanization affects the water table, the recharge of the water table. It takes the whole natural system of flood control and so forth off the table. And you also, as the accompaniment to that, have the adaptation to sea level rise as an issue. So I guess this is my scene setting.
And you did it under 20, you have 22 seconds left.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Now we're going to get a little more specific with Lee Sobel from the EPA. He is with real estate development and finance, and he's going to talk about the Miami-Dade, that's your 22 seconds, Miami-Dade County urban development boundary. He's going to talk a little bit about that in 10 minutes.
I thought I had 15.
You need to get my slides off the screen.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
I should have done.
Actually, yours is already called up. Oh, is it?
Okay.
Okay.
reduced on the bottom.
I see, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Lee Sobel. I'm from Miami, Florida. I work in Washington, D.C. at the EPA's Office of Sustainable Communities, and I'm going to be talking about work we did with Miami-Dade County and their urban development boundary. I believe you already know what smart growth is, or you've been to a 101 yesterday, so I'm not going to actually go through what is smart growth. But probably more important and relevant to my interaction with it is what is the EPA's role with smart growth. And we believe that because our mission is to protect the environment and human health, how and where we build have direct impacts, both positive and negative, on the natural environment and public health. And so we work through doing research and policy development, outreach and education like this, and technical assistance on these issues to help communities where we're invited to look at smart growth and implement smart growth, either policies or projects. My office also represents the EPA and the Partnership for Sustainable Communities with HUD and DOT. Just for my own information, I'm curious, who has heard of the Partnership for Sustainable Communities? A little more than half. Okay, good. So we still have some work to do. The title of the session was the Florida Transect. I think many of you probably know what the Transect is. If you don't, I put an illustration of the DPZ, one of their versions of the Transect, where it goes from most urban of the built to the natural environment. I'm actually going to be focusing on the natural environment and its impacts to the built environment and how water can play a role in saving natural lands. So, as I mentioned, our office provides technical assistance, and in 2010, we provided Miami-Dade County with assistance on how they might move their urban growth boundary, which they call an urban development boundary. These things are essentially the four tasks that we were slotted to do. I'm going to talk mostly about the infill and the conservation. We were not tasked with, and nor did we accept to talk about where they might move their line. That's really a local decision. So if you'll indulge me for about 4 slides, I just want to tell you a little bit about the urban development boundary. It was created in 1975 with a little over 230,000 acres. This particular UDB has to contain a 10-year supply of land for residential development plus a 5-year reserve of land for residential development. The county has twice amended the UDB in the 80s, but they have done many more private amendments as developers have brought them forward. Very little land has been added actually since the 90s. Today, the urban growth boundary has almost 270,000 acres. Outside the boundary, there's still 1 million acres within the county, most of it permanently preserved. And then there's still land for housing, which I'll explain in a minute, even though it's a growth boundary line, and almost 70,000 acres that is actively used for agricultural land. In 2009, which is part of the reason they came to us, they had identified only 6% of the land within the UDB was remaining for development. That was undeveloped land. And that essentially sets off their red flags because that 6% land raises the question of whether or not they have or do not have enough land to satisfy the 10-year or 5-year reserve criteria, and then might have to move this boundary again. And how they did it and what ways they may wind up doing it is really where they came to us for help. Some of the other critical issues here was an urban growth boundary is not a preservation tool. It's also not. It also harms some of their conservation goals because you can still live outside the growth boundary, but because they don't have traditional Miami-Dade County zoning for R1, 2, 3, they actually have what they call estate lots, and they let people come in and build 1 unit per 5 or 1 unit per 2.5 acres. So that actually impedes both fiscal money for service areas as well as eating into habitat and ag land. They also want to obviously keep the amount of ag land they have that's outside the urban growth boundary because they believe of the 67,000 acres, their studies show from other communities that when you drop below 50,000 acres, you lose a regional operations and systemic industry of agriculture. So they want to try and keep as much of that as possible. The city does have an active promotion of infill through their urban center districts, but Miami is only one city of 35 municipalities in the county, and in fact, even still, owners and developers of infill may not actually do infill on available parcels. So there's this whole challenge of how much do we move the boundary, how much infill and density can we have. Maybe enough density will require us to not have to move the boundary as far as possible. So these are the conclusions that we helped work with them in terms of policies. And I'm not going to read them. In fact, many of the things in my slide I'm really leaving here at CNU, so you can go on the website and look in detail at the research and findings we did. But what I'll mostly be talking about then, as I sort of drill down, Jonathan, I think, did a great job doing it numerically and through GIS. We sort of do it with tools and policies, which is what I'm going to show you. Is I was going to focus on the water policies for infill. So for us, what we find, being the EPA and working with the Office of Water, is the best way to protect water quality is through preservation, recycling, reduction, and reuse. And what we mean by that is in white, and I'm just going to sort of highlight it with just blip case studies. But obviously, preserving critical lands in large blocks and continuous areas of open space or ecological areas is important. Down at the neighborhood and block level, we like to preserve open space in different settings of parks, plazas, and other uses that don't just amenitize a property, but also might add to a green infrastructure system within a neighborhood. And I put a little bit of information here just so you could see that it actually also provides fiscal and property value benefits to the local community. With regard to recycling, we always talk about trying to reuse existing infrastructure in already degraded areas. So the case study I picked is Meisner Park in Boca Raton, just to show you on this 29 acres, when it was a mall, it was 100% paved. So there was 100% impervious cover. As Meisner Park, you now have the Green Plaza running down the middle, and you also have the park at the amphitheater. So in fact, the impervious cover has decreased by 15% through the goals of infill development, density, and then using other types of water infrastructure. We always talk about reducing land consumption, and we look at ways, which ways development is better for watershed, water quality, low density or high density. And this is a report that's also on our website, which is epa.gov/smart growth. You can find all three of the reports I'm going to show you today, including the first one on the urban growth boundary. Funny enough, a lot of developers actually love this report. It really talks about how higher density is better for water quality. And also, from a fiscal standpoint, when it comes to putting in the costs associated with sewer and water, it's actually cheaper under the growth scenarios we did under compact development than typical lower density development. So it has this fiscal benefit, not just being good for the water and the environment as well. And we also talk about mixing the land uses, and not just being about density, but having vertical density, horizontal density, and then mixing the uses there so that you can have this compact environment, which relieves pressure on development and also provides less impervious cover for the uses that you apply. Then we talk about how with single-use development you sort of have these different sorts of degradations in the amount of pervious pavement that's required. So sort of the third piece of this presentation that I'm now at is essentially looking at green infrastructure and best practices that we typically promote and offer to communities that are interested in, at the neighborhood and block level, to talk about how they can reuse water, get it back into the ground after they hold it, do it in a way that's pretty interesting, that adds value to a community, and that also can play dual roles or multiple roles in a community, whether it's active or passive. So just looking at wider streets and then bringing in stormwater swales is one example, taking wide residential streets and putting in curb extensions, again, having a wide sidewalk and then narrowing that sidewalk with stormwater planters, or things that we've done with communities. This is all Louisville and Covington, Kentucky were the three examples I just happened to show. And then the last report that I just wanted to mention, which provides the tools that we use to enhance water quality in some of these infill tools we use and suggested to Miami-Dade County, is through this water quality scorecard. And what it does is it helps communities understand and assess what they have, what they might do, and then prioritize some of the tools to help them meet their goals quickly and efficiently and most cost effectively. These are a few slides I'm not going to read. I'm really leaving for you when you check back on the CNU website. But a lot of people and communities that have their own stormwater standards have what we would call bad regulatory responses, whether foreseen or unforeseen. These are some of the things or reasons why some stormwater codes are actually problematic for some communities. And so these are some of the better responses that our office has promoted, both through our own research and working with other communities that have really taken a lead to changing stormwater standards. And in fact, I think what a lot of you probably know, since you're here and this is an important issue, is the EPA is currently thinking about a new national stormwater rule. Our office has the fortunate I have 2 more slides left. We have the fortunate opportunity to include within the new stormwater rules a code revision checklist that actually helps people understand how they need to protect the natural resources and open space, how they promote compact development and infill, how they incorporate complete streets, how they use efficient parking to better minimize impervious cover, and then how they apply green infrastructure on the site using some of the tools and examples I just previously showed you. So at 20 seconds over, I'd like to say thank you very much.
I'm very impressed, actually.
Better than the Pechacuta.
Thanks, Lee. Marcella Cambler, who is principal at Marcella Cambler Associates, will talk to us about the TVC, Towns, Village, and Countryside plans for St. Lucia.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Let me see if, does this count towards my time?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'll tell you.
Just minimize that.
Okay.
Bring yours up.
All right. Since I'm not getting help. There
That's
you
right.
go. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to talk to you very briefly in quite a generic way about the TVC, the Towns, Villages, and Countryside comprehensive plan element for St. Lucie County. This was the first of its kind in Florida. There have been several other plans or similar comprehensive plan amendments that have followed this. It started in 2005, and there are a lot of the elements of this plan and conditions that were occurring in St. Lucie County back in 2005, very similar to what Lee just described. This is an element of the county's comprehensive plan for a 60 square mile area in the northern portion of St. Lucie County. What's interesting about this, Lee talked about the urban growth boundary up in St. Lucie, or urban in Miami-Dade, excuse me. In St. Lucie County, it's this yellow line that you see here. The intracoastal waterway is here to the east. And this yellow dotted line is the urban service boundary. And it's not supposed to have, by law, what they call islands, but for some reason this one there did, because there's a highway exit. This is I-95 right here. And what's interesting, it's not in many of our Florida counties, the urban service boundary didn't mean that you weren't going to have development outside of that line, or in this case, because it's an eastern county west of that line, it just meant that services were not going to be provided. But a lot of the people, a lot of the community understands that line as a line that's drawn in the sand beyond which no development will ever occur. And it was a rude awakening for the residents of St. Lucie County when a lot of them that were living in this area or have moved to this area, because all of this that you see west of that yellow line was essentially zoned agriculture. There were a lot of orange groves and agricultural uses occurring at that time there. When they saw in 2005 the first pretty intense suburban development gated community being proposed right smack in the middle of this area. And of course they started to attend commission meetings to say that, you know, you can't build here, this is agricultural, it's west of the urban services boundary. But what happened was that they realized that, and forgive me, because it's agricultural lands, water is drained in a system of canals, and that's how all the ag land there deals with the water and the drainage issues. But what happened was that the county contracted the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council to help them resolve these issues and to help the community understand what could really happen in that area. And a quick exercise was done to show the community that under the existing comprehensive plan or land use and zoning, this is what the entire sort of area inside the urban services boundary would look over time if development were implemented per the existing rules. And this is how it would look if the actual rules got implemented. Again, there was agricultural zoning, but the underlying land use allowed for residential uses. And so as a result of that, through 2 years of community participation, the Towns, Villages, and Countryside Citizen Master Plan was created. The key components of this plan, and I see Jean, Scott, and Doris have all worked hard on this and assisted us in putting this plan together, is that it retains large areas of the countryside. Again, it's a reorganization of land use entitlements. We couldn't do away, we couldn't just retire those land use entitlements, but so we worked to reorganize them and preserve large areas of the countryside. And of course there had to be a big sort of carrot attached to that, to requiring the reorganization. There was a big stick as well, but it also creates a central backbone system for water management. Rather than having the water dealt with on a parcel-by-parcel basis, it required the creation of a central backbone system for water management. Of course, that resulted in an interconnected system of greenways and parks and open spaces, an interconnected network of roadways. It is very specific as to where not just the preserved agricultural lands or just preserved open space goes, but where the actual smaller towns and squares and plazas and the civic buildings and the service and the retail is to be placed within each one of the towns or villages that are developed in that area as the land uses get reorganized. And it is Transect based. Again, I'm also not going to go through the details of the Transect, but I will give you information where to find all this at the end of this presentation, because it applies pretty much whether you are in an agricultural or green field or a green area as this was, or if you're trying to apply some of the more urban components into an already developed area. So like I said, it's Transect based, and like Lee, I'm going to focus on the edge or the public open space component of this.
It's a nice diagram.
Oh, thank you. Which I think is what really got the community behind this plan. It was the notion that, yes, the development was going to occur beyond the urban services boundary. Yes, it was probably going to be at much higher density and intensity that had originally been planned under the current land uses, but in exchange, 60% of that land would forever become public open space, and that the water was going to be dealt in such a way that it wasn't just going to be little private lakes behind somebody's house, but an actual accessible and public flowway that connected through the entire area. And so there's a number of diagrams as to how each one of those neighborhoods become towns or villages, and villages become towns, and how the green space and flowway need to be designed and attached to the development, and how essentially one feeds off of the other. It's pretty interesting because that percentage came out of figuring out how much open space you really needed in order to recycle your own water and make sure that this was an independent unit, that if nothing else happened outside, this entire area would be sustainable in and of itself.
3 minutes.
Like I said, the flowway is a backbone system for a comprehensive water management system. At the time this plan, just after this plan was approved, it was approved back in late 2007, early 2008, and then it was upheld in court. And then the code was prepared, a form-based code, and that went to court too, and it was upheld as well. A number of private developers came in and planned vast areas of this 60 square mile. A total of 2,109 acres were planned for new towns and villages. And as a result, 1,228 acres, if those plans that are either approved or in some process of approval get implemented, 1,228 acres will forever be preserved, and 10.6 miles of flowway will be created. And then again, that's only a part of this 60 square miles. So it was pretty impressive. And again, like I said, the reason why the community got behind and supported increases in everything they had opposed before. If you want the details of all of this, land use, zoning, LDRs, just go to the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council's website, and all the documents are there. Thank you.
I know, she gets the prize. Well done. She gets an extra minute in the question and answer. Thank you. We're now going to hear from Dan Sloan, who's a partner at McGuire Woods, and once again, at the bookstore, a great book, The Law of Urban and Sustainable Development, that he co-authored with Doris Goldstein. Could you raise your hand, Doris, who also worked on that last project? So Dan is going to take us probably through more tools and techniques across the transects that can be actually utilized in any area of the world. Thank you.
Florida is a special place for many, many reasons, but from a water perspective, it has unusual challenges of saltwater intrusion in its groundwater, saltwater lines moving up its rivers, wars with Georgia, all sorts of interesting things. And the sort of stimulus to the presentation title, not only in some parts of Florida, but distinguishing from different sections of Florida, too much water at some times of the year and too little at other times of the year. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some different responses along the Transect, but I want to put it in context first of one of my beliefs, which is that we have a number of things stimulating opportunity right now. Besides those challenges I mentioned, I think that the need to adapt, our need to comply with EPA standards, our need to build more resilient communities in response to hurricanes all actually create an opportunity to make some very different choices instead of simply rebuilding or moving the things we've been doing, to rethink our water notions. And one of the things I feel strongly about is that water should be treated as a single resource, not as three separate resources: wastewater, potable water, and stormwater. So that one of the most important things that would happen is, before we actually start restructuring our systems or taking our next step, that we would bring them all together under that one roof and realize how they relate to one another. And I think it's fundamental to beginning the process of looking at this across the Transect. Another important aspect of that is to realize that energy is related to water fundamentally. And so when we make a decision to approve a coal-fired, a nuclear, or a gas-fired plant, we've made a decision to use water. We need cooling water to do that. We've also made a decision that when that water runs low and we're forced to choose between recreation or support of fish and wildlife or keeping the cooling going to the utility, we historically keep the cooling going to the utility. We don't shut down hospitals. We don't shut down the rest of the system. That has ecological consequences. And so our energy choices, our choice to have, now think of how few energy sources we have that don't actually use water. Because even if we turn to something like ethanol or other choices, we use water. So there are only a couple of them out there. And as we look at certain parts of our Transect, particularly the rural parts of our Transect, we need to think about those as our energy zones as well. Florida is a place that has a lot of resources that there's still a little bit of ambiguity as to whether it would draw on those resources. But I would submit to you that that is a water question as much as it is an alt energy question. In the rural areas, we have a lot more flexibility on the way we interact with water, whether we choose to store it. We have a lot more land to deal with. And by and large, how we dispose of water or utilize it is not as big an issue in those areas, though they are critical to the rest of the Transect in meeting our sustainability goals. When we move in the Transect some, we get choices in our suburban retrofits that you hear in other sections of this. One of the ones that I would emphasize today in terms of tools is, as you think of right-of-way easements, as you think of parks, as you think of basically everything green, either that you're retrofitting or deciding to continue forward, and it uses water, think of what we're producing in those areas. So that I no longer believe that there should be many such things as parks or street trees or right-of-ways that we are expending water, fertilizing, expenditures of labor that don't either give us food, fuel, or habitat for a creature that we want to keep in our world. So, the notion that we would look at each one of these expenditures and realize how it fits in a sustainable agenda is critical. And that criticality occurs probably most in the suburban setting right now because it has the most of that maintained landscape. When we move into the rural, it's typically not maintained. When we move further into the city, there's not as much of that. It becomes more important for a number of uses, but there's not as much of that, so there's not as much money going into it and not as much water going into it. So as we move in the Transect into more urban areas, one of the other things that's important in this notion of combining our water sources is when we think of them together. And remember, one of the most incredible things to me is that we take water that falls for free from the sky, we pay a lot of money to get it out. And then we turn around and pay a lot of money to bring other water in from underground or from a river someplace. We often minimally use it. We are still a backwards technology of using water, one of the most precious resources, to move waste. Understand how foolish, if we were a business, we'd be a laughable business. Because no business would do these stupid things that we do. So rethinking this and realizing that when we distribute some of these decisions, we create an opportunity for infill and redevelopment that actually distributes the wastewater treatment so you can harvest the wastewater there. Distribute stormwater treatment so that you can harvest the stormwater there. Each of those decisions may mean that I need to replace less pipe. So it changes the economics of my redevelopment. These decisions on the economics and water are all related, but they're most related when we treat them as a single resource and we begin thinking, what are my opportunities when I concentrate on, and this is what you hear about now in eco-districts, living city blocks, a number of movements around the country to begin thinking about this increment at something other than the city level. That doesn't mean it always makes sense. There are some places, particularly where we already have storm sewers in place and those sorts of things, not combined, but separate, where in fact interventions in those make more sense because we've already got infrastructure in place. But there are a lot of places where this notion of distribution, even where I take and intercept existing lines and pull it out and say, I need water, instead of sending it all the way back to the wastewater treatment plant, then try to get reuse water all the way back to me, what happens if I distribute this decision? So, then there are other more urban elements. I believe that, the water storage is a technology that we're becoming increasingly aware of, increasingly good at. It's interesting to go to Barcelona and see that Gaudi was putting water storage on the top of his buildings, and that, this is not a new concept. It's one we've simply lost. And integrating these water choices into our parks and urban agriculture, I do not believe that there should be another green roof that is done on potable water except for a temporary pathway to get it started. I do not believe there should be urban agriculture that is done on potable water without being integrated into other cities. Now, I support both green roofs and urban agriculture, but we have to interrelate these decisions. We also have to think about the fact that industry is incredibly important to an equation like in Florida. I've been in Florida where they've turned on the sprinklers on the golf courses, and they were using reuse water. Yay, it had just rained. There was no way that water was being absorbed. In fact, I was told that they'd been instructed that they were to put more reuse water in there, which has all sorts of bad consequences for the water bodies around that. So what happens when we try to structure things in this system in which sometimes we have too much water? Well, one of the great things that creates is there are economics that cause me to be willing to give industry water. So to take somebody who I might have been selling water to at other points of the year and say, at this point in the year, I want to give you water. Just flat that. And my economics improve because now I don't have to deal with storage. I don't have to deal with a number of things that are expensive and have other challenges to me. I connect myself better to my industry. I create something that's very hard for them to recreate someplace else. And what I do is integrate them. Well, that means I need industry. But part of how I attract industry should be to prepare for this sort of interaction. And when I bring that industry, by the way, often I bring an opportunity for combined heat and power, which feeds back into my utility issues, and I avoid another need for yet another power source. 2 minutes. Super. Green roofs are important. All right. This notion of the relationship of both agriculture and industry applies across the whole transect. It just applies in different ways. And as we look at different aspects of the transect, one of the things I would say is that there are some things like green walls and green roofs that are much more important in our urban portions of the transect. They are less important when we move out the transect and we've got a lot more ground. They're important in the urban areas because, again, if we're thinking about them, they create habitat, they create the opportunity for food. They're not necessarily as important as energy or simple green roofs of themselves. They are important when we integrate them into what are we trying to produce with these things. We have a number of form-based codes out there from a lot of great authors, Dover Cole, Opticos, DPZ, have created form-based codes that include these elements along the transect. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize is this notion of that there are different ways to intervene for stormwater, for rainwater harvesting, for gray water. All of these things are different according to where you are on the transect. Finally, I just wanted to show you that there are projects out there that emphasize this difference in where we are. Here you have a mixed retrofit and a suburban project. It relies on a greenway, something not as useful in an urban area. Similarly, this project relies on constructed wetlands to protect the adjoining water bodies, and users reharvest from those constructed areas. And I wanted to close with this reference to Noisette, as originally planned before its recent unfortunate elements. Noisette wanted to integrate these notions and actually drive into its town center swales along the main street. And this is one of the things that's somewhat controversial in the world of urbanists. This is a choice. Though this could have been done integrating into tree wells and into a sidewalk area and didn't have to be an overt element. They made a choice, though. This was a signature part of the distinction of North Charleston, which was emphasizing its environmental theme, from Charleston that was representing itself with urbanity. So they focused on those aspects. Thank you very much.
Okay, panelists and our audience, open to questions till 3:15. If the panelists have questions for each other or for the audience, you feel free to jump in. Anyone wants to run up here and use the mic can, or yell out your question from there. Yes. Please identify yourself, where you're from, and your interest. I'm going to repeat the question. Open water breeds mosquitoes. Has anybody dealt with that issue?
So I have. The city of D.C. has a green building zoning ordinance, and in it there is provisions for site retention, for holding the water, open water in their swales, and the water has to move out within 24 hours, which is apparently the larval or beyond the larval time, so that water that does sit and is held until it can slowly go back into the ground doesn't pool long enough to actually have the larva.
And I would say we've had one other version of that, and a similar sort of discussion where mosquitoes were not as common. But when we move south, where it's somewhat laughable when you compare the amount of wetlands that surround most of our areas and are already the subject of these interactive discussions of how do we manage mosquito control, introducing the sort of stormwater or management techniques that we're talking about generally aren't perceived as changing the nature of the interaction. So we just do whatever we've been doing to a broader area. There was an issue that came up that was a little scarier, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere, and that was actually the possibility that in some of the swale areas that viruses would actually be maintained and would extend communication with other viruses, and that it was actually a potential health problem to have the sorts of wetland areas that extend into highly populated zones. That was raised and sort of attacked academically and doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But from other health perspectives, not much trouble with this.
Can you talk about a little bit about your Australian experience? You have to speak up really loud.
Yeah, the process seems to be local agencies go in and they treat the infections during those critical larval stages, particularly the saltwater mosquitoes, and that seems to be effective, but it's very expensive. I'm just wondering if there's a treatment process. I heard yesterday from the landscape architect that they used some flour or other which is ground and it comes out as sort of a vegetable oil product which floats on the surface, but it's only part of the measure.
That's a very temporary thing that you can do in areas that are rather small, is put something that floats on the water, a skim of oil. But the techniques you say they use in Australia, is it spraying? Is it water movement?
Spraying from helicopters.
Spraying from helicopters is very expensive, short-term, potentially difficult. Does malaria change the equation as we have global warming and the malarial line moves?
Could. I mean, one of the interesting things is to go into Central America and see, the broadcast use of DDT. And when children start contracting diseases, people's environmental responses change. In Florida, for many, many years, the response to all of this was to favor the concentrations of people by spraying the people instead of trying to spray all of the wet. So I grew up in Florida riding behind the trucks that spewed out chemicals. May explain a lot now, but that has been our response. Is it's pretty much cheaper to spray the people than spray the mosquitoes.
Or immunize them. Jonathan, were you trying to say something? Yes. Your name, please, and where you're from.
In Orlando, that's what they do, foggy trucks.
Uh-huh.
You had mentioned in one of the presentations that the suburban context seems to be a ripe opportunity for intervention given the amount of landscape that they're constantly trying to maintain and the surface area. And it occurs to me when I saw the one picture of water recapture of rain barrels that is the oldest technology around, and yet it hasn't, given all our concerns, there hasn't been a tremendous improvement in water recapture technology. When you go to Home Depot, you still see pretty much an old-fashioned rain barrel, and there hasn't been much progress both in capturing and advancing the adoption of rain barrels, or advancing the technology to make it better, more useful, more implemented. Even the roofs haven't really changed to promote that.
Okay, I want to attack rain barrels.
So what is the friction there? It seems like such an easy approach, and what could be causing that?
This is a personal interest of mine as an owner of 2 rain barrels that I find a complete pain in the butt. One of the challenges is once you get water in the rain barrels, what you use it for, how fast it's gone, finding the soaker hoses and all the rest of it. David Gottfried of the U.S. founder of the U.S. Green Building Council, puts an active pump in his to keep them going. But the fact is the technologies have moved forward. There are bladder technologies that go under porches and decks that are actually much more efficient and are easily designed to really make a difference and harvest whole roof water. So the challenge is most of those need to be addressed either in the initial building of the house or in a retrofit, and they're a little harder to fit into the Home Depot go and buy a solution market. So rain barrels are fine. I see them sort of as the entry mechanism. They teach you that you should be doing something, and then you get frustrated with them and go out and try to figure out what you should really be doing. Lee, you wanted to talk about the light impact?
Well, I was in my neighborhood. I live in Rockville in Montgomery County. The rain barrel program, I think, in my neighborhood has been a gateway drug to recycling. They seem to not work. They leak. You have to go and put them together at the class, and then you take it home with you. By the time you get it out of your trunk or your back seat, something has already broken off. I find for the user, especially my older neighbors, they decide they don't like where they put it. It's hard to mow around, and then suddenly the whole thing just is a headache they don't want to deal with. But what I have also been telling my neighbors is there's other things that they can do in terms of capture and holding, separating their driveway from their house so that there's green or gravel in between the house where the runoff comes from the roof, so it doesn't just go to the driveway into the gutter, and other low impact development plans that both we had shown for neighborhoods and that DPZ has done for low impact development, I think are better landscape solutions as opposed to product type solutions. I just think I think the rain barrel is also very a specific use, whereas some of the things you can do with landscaping has more of a general holistic use for other types of things, not just holding water or moving water.
Could I also use this as a moment to say something important about the suburban setting? Another of the opportunities in the suburban setting is to interact with the homeowners association. And that's important because real changes that don't require redundancy of, yeah, I put rain barrels, but I had to have exactly the same stormwater system around that because you couldn't rely on whether the rain barrels would be used or not used, everything. Real changes that allow you to not implement other parts of the stormwater response have to be reliable. They have to be something that agencies can count on being in place. And one of the advantages of suburbia with typically homeowner associations is the homeowner association can intervene as the force that keeps those reliable, keeps homeowners aware of where their rain gardens are or the other elements that are built in, makes sure inspections happen, all of these sorts of things, and overcomes one of the objections that we face from localities that if they approve these more mixed systems of public and private, that they won't be able to rely on the private, or in order to rely on the private, they'll have to spend a lot more money to inspect and maintain. So there are other advantages these sorts of systems have in suburbia.
Jonathan.
It might be worth making a distinction between the eastern part of the country, where we appear to have plenty of water for a foreseeable future, and the western part of the country where water is scarce. There was a study done in Los Angeles that if every individual house in Los Angeles and a few of the public institutions had water capture systems, essentially rain barrels, that Los Angeles could save 35% of its water usage. And that is because potable drinking water is being used to wash cars and water gardens, and that you could possibly use there is still a timing issue and a preservation issue and a mosquito issue with all of these problems. But I noticed in reading builders' magazines that there are now, for new construction, there are rain barrels. The energy question with that would be that the typical home builder's polyvinyl rain barrel uses a pump. And I guess the question would be, is from an environmental accounting point of view, are you worse off having to use an electric pump in order to conserve water, or are you better off conserving the water? Do you know the answer to that?
No, I don't. And there's also the big plastic 55-gallon drum that's being used
Yeah.
as a rain barrel.
So EPA, get on it.
David Gottfried actually did some analysis on the pump and basically said the infrequent use that the pump has in a rain barrel, given the capacity issues of the rain barrel, compared to the energy that's used to move the water one direction or another, if you're trying to do any sort of reuse, was pretty significant in the positive side. So his conclusion was that the small interventions, even multiplied by a lot, would be useful. The other distinction that you have to be aware of when you head west or into water scarcity is that in some states you can't use rain barrels. It's only been within the last couple of years that Colorado authorized rain barrels because the downstream owners are dependent on surface water, and they flip our eastern version of you shouldn't be causing any more water to leave your site than before development into you shouldn't be causing any less water to leave your site, and there's a real tension over water capture along the way.
Marcella, I'm very interested in how TVC is sold and how people have taken it on. How effective is it? Are people proud of it? Do they wear it you know, as a proud accomplishment of the community. How's that happening? How's that going? And can you tell me a little bit about the timeline?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the bottom fell off with the first few projects were getting ready to come off the ground. But one of the things that I found the most interesting, I'm a firm believer in the public process. Every project that I had the fortune of working on with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council was community-based. And this was interesting because as we were doing the project, we confronted enormous resistance from the development community. There were a number of builders associations from all over Florida that would drive to every one of our meetings from all over the state just to fight that approval, because it was going to set important precedents for the rest of the state. And that drove the process into a process that had 125 public meetings. What they didn't realize was that the community kept attending those meetings, and in the end, I have this picture of one of the first residents that kept coming in to complain, and he raised parrots. He lived there. And he was the gentleman that stood up and was able to explain the benefits of this plan even better than any of the planners we had hired and had working with us. So the community became so educated that was the strength behind it, and that's been what's kept it from, amendments going through in these years of a recession with people claiming, well, we just really need to change it because the economy has changed. And so it's so embedded, and the community is so proud and so educated that it's just become the tool.
Is there a slogan?
No, there is no slogan. It's it's catchy enough with the TVC. You either, if you know what it is, you're a part of it. If not,
Okay.
you can't build here.
And do the kids like it? Do the schools take it on board, or?
I don't know. I don't think we did this and took it to the schools. We took it to the courts, but we didn't take it to the school.
So Jonathan, you showed us some pretty compelling images, and so has it caused a stir that the Keys are going to go underwater? Is anyone paying attention? Is anyone there to listen? And
Respond to that too. Go ahead.
yeah, sure. And also, what should CNU be doing about it?
Well, I've saved some of this for, we were going to have a talk about research tomorrow. I think this is adaptation to sea level rise seems to me to be a very important issue for CNU, because most of the major cities certainly in the United States and absolutely all around the world are in coastal locations. So what was interesting, what happened in New Orleans was a kind of wake-up call on this issue for a lot of people. In the Netherlands, they saw it as a kind of nightmare replay of what had happened in the Netherlands in the 1950s, and they had built all these storm surge defenses in the Netherlands in the 50s, and they also did this in England. But it's caused people in both places to look at those defenses and say, wait a minute, how good are they? Some of the dikes in the Netherlands, for example, go back hundreds and hundreds of years. So the question comes up, what's in those? So these are the places which do have some protection against the sea already. London has a Thames barrier, which they are now studying. It came into use about 30 years after the big floods in '53. It took that long to build it, and it's been used in excess of 70 times since then to protect the central part of London from storm surges coming along the Thames River. Now they are restudying it. They're going to raise the size of the barrier, so by 2030 they are predicting that storm surges would overwhelm the barrier. Now in the United States, the only city which had storm surge protection was New Orleans. And in New Orleans, the storm surge protection failed because of faulty design and faulty construction. And I'm not sure that anybody in the United States has really understood the message from this yet. A lot of people are still going around saying it's New Orleans' own fault for being in the wrong place. And besides, it's an inefficiently managed city, and they brought it on themselves. If you apply that criterion to New York City, to Miami, to Boston, to Galveston, which has a history of all of it, there are an awful lot of these United States cities which are just as vulnerable as New Orleans right now. And this problem is going to get worse. The Florida Keys is a very special case because the protection of the keys may be a write-off. It may not make enough sense to protect the keys, except maybe Key West or the larger pieces of land there. So when we were doing these studies at the University of Pennsylvania, I was a little bit afraid of sidetracking the discussion. That I thought scaring people over stormwater surges from hurricanes in Florida was probably not the most productive way of getting people to think about land planning. But I think it is a very, very significant issue which has to be addressed. Let me add one more thing about that, which is that these studies that we did a study for the Delaware River Basin in Philadelphia, and we showed that in a storm surge even today, you could have the airport flooded. Philadelphia is much less likely. So what do you do about this likelihood? Do you scare people now, or do you wait till it happens? There are a lot of issues which have to do with where you locate, which are going to have to be looked at in the next 25 or 30 years, of which the keys are probably the most significant. But the one other point I wanted to make was that if you want to scare people, you better have really good information. And there are two sets of variables on this which are very important. One is, what are the actual elevations of the land that you're talking about? So if you take the worldwide average for sea level, that's the other one. If you have the worldwide average for sea level rise, what does that actually have to do with the specific location? Because every location is different. Some land is rising, some land is falling in relation to the sea. The sea, it turns out, has contours, something I never understood until I started getting into this, so you can map a sea and see what amount to mountains and valleys. So you have to know what the sea level elevation is, and then you need accurate land level elevations. And the USGS survey is all very well for general policy discussion, but you need real LIDAR info. So New York City is one city that's taking this very seriously, and they're doing both. They've had convened a panel to make a determination about what sea level rise to predict for New York metro area, and then secondly, they are trying to figure out what the elevation is of all of the stuff that might be at risk. And these, I think, are really important steps before you go before the public and say, hey, I don't think you'd better build a wing on your house.
My life is, always evolves around big regional plans. So I'm currently the director for the Southeast Florida partnership for it's essentially, I won't tell you the entire name because we're in the process of getting a new identity and a new name, which everybody will hear about soon. But essentially, it's a plan for 7 counties: Monroe, Broward, Dade, Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River, and it's a 50-year plan. And we are looking at everything from transportation, to housing, to job creation and economic development, understanding how as a region we need to become more competitive within the state and within the country and globally. But one of the key components that we're tackling is precisely sea level rise. We are working with a number. We have assembled a great consultant team. It's led by Dover Cole and DPZ, and there's 16 other firms that are a part of that team. But a part of that team is also.
How do you manage 16 firms?
I'm a tough girl.
Okay.
No, they're awesome. They don't need to be managed. But anyways, the Climate Compact, which is an agreement between 3 counties, Broward, Dade, and Monroe counties, is a pretty robust group. They have been doing a lot of studies already for those 3 counties and are now going to extend their efforts to the northern 4 counties. You can see their work online. It's in the Broward.org website. You can see the prediction for sea level rise in these 3 southern counties at 1, 2, and 3 feet already. And I think my understanding is one of the issues is, yes, parts of the keys, or a great part of the key, is going to disappear. There's, I was happy to see that the coolest parts of Key West probably will stay there, but that because of the type of soil that we have in our region, we couldn't, build dikes or build things that would stop this, because it would be a bathtub bathtub effect. It would come in from under. So part of what we are going to have to do is figure out what, in effect, is the potential sea level rise, which are the areas, and how we're going to communicate this to the public. So this is a 3-year process where we're 1 year into it. So in the next couple of years, part of what we have to do is get the community as a whole to understand this, understand the real consequences, make sure it doesn't become sort of a panic, but and we can't go to the community until we understand exactly what it is and how we're going to deal with it.
I'd like to ask a question just on this. How do you, it seems to me that there's a cycle here that's pretty troublesome, is the more clearly you communicate that an area is in a zone that is going to, let's say an area of houses is in a zone, the more clearly that will be communicated to the value of that property, which means that under pretty much any circumstances it's going to face decline, lack of available resources to generate any sort of individual responses. So it seems to me that there's a connection here, that there's one of the challenges of communication is there will be problems just from the communication, whether in the end it's right or wrong.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have already seen these plans, and a lot of people have already figured out that their homes are going to be underwater, and I think that many have been dealing with this by saying, well, it won't happen until 2060, and I probably won't be around. But one of the challenges we're also facing is, at what point does your title company need to start saying, this is only going to be, land until a certain year, and insurance and all those other things. So we haven't figured all those things out, but we're in the process.
So it becomes a title company.
Well, it's an incredibly vast. That's just one of the examples. But
I just want to let you know that Rainwater in Context Initiative, which has been underway now for well over a year, I think it's a couple of years, meets tomorrow. I can't say the word pachakacha, but that's what they're doing. Rapid fire presentation from a lot of different folks from across the spectrum of government.
Charette wasn't hard enough, right? Now that people got it.
We're not allowed to. They called us and said, take it off the program. So I didn't say it. And then there will be a luncheon conversation about where to go with CNU on these issues, so people are invited to do that. And we wanted to continue this conversation for a couple of seconds more. But I just wanted to let you know that that's a good place to maybe bring the whole issue of particularly sea level rising issues to the fore, because I don't think that's been a major part of that conversation thus far. And we had a question over here. Yes, sir.
This was a while back.
That's okay. Go for it.
I know that I am from Orlando.
What's your name? Hi, Trevor.
Originally from the Barrier Island, which will, by 2060, be on my house, will be about knee-high. But in any case, I spent some time in Colorado, and you were talking about the Colorado issues, and I know that in Colorado, they prefer agricultural land to city land, as most people would, because agricultural land returns about 50% of the water that it uses. City land is near 100% consumption. It's used and has to be wastewater treated and all of these things. And my curiosity was, do we have the same trade-off here? And is there a way for us in the urban areas to get the agricultural return, get the return of water that the agricultural areas get?
That would be an interesting discussion and bear some further examination, because by and large, agricultural uses are very inefficient uses of water. So one of the places that many people identify low-hanging fruit is by improving the efficiencies of agriculture, but it is improvable, and it responds to that pretty well. One of the things that happens related to your question, and I don't know that it directly answers it, though, is when we capture stormwater in an urban setting, we are even when we utilize it in landscape, for example, we are recharging an aquifer that has regional consequences around there. The more direct urban question there comes up as, is it necessarily, and this comes up mostly in comparing that sort of slow recharge of watering landscape with trying to do LID, in which we're sort of pushing water into the ground quickly. When we do that in urban areas, one of the things that comes up is those urban areas are often underlined by some of the nastiest stuff that we've ever created. So there's a lot of oil, got a lot of bad stuff in there. And so one of the questions that does come up in this comparison of agriculture or urban landscape as water is whether it's a good idea to push water into the to the urban setting. The flexibility of consumer use of water it has barely been explored. You want some fun sometime, Google the number of technologies that are currently being explored to replace water-based toilets. And it's huge because it is so obvious that we are using an ancient technology of moving, toothpaste excess and showers and stuff that there's really just, it's very hard to justify why we're using all this water in this fashion. So there's a huge opportunity for a change in residential use that is increasingly looked at as not just a behavioral element, but a technology element and a shift off of the base. And when this came up in one of our green discussions, there were folks from Sloan Valve there and people I thought would be hostile to this. Oh, we got to stick with water. And that's not true. Almost every one of the major companies that work in that space are busy trying to figure out how to get off of water because they believe that the push in the future is going to be, as we see in China right now, the humans using water as opposed to using it in industry, as opposed to use it in agriculture, is about their worst idea.
Can we thank our panel and thank you for being such a great group?